Hello, Blogging Heads audience. This is Glenn Loury, The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, coming from Brown University, Department of Economics, where I reside, and hosting today Professor Rajiv Sethi, who's an economist, a professor at Barnard College, Columbia University, and an old friend and collaborator of mine. And we're here to talk about talking in public on controversial political issues. Welcome, Rajiv.
Oh, thank you, Glenn. Glad to be back.
So, forgive me for a point of personal privilege, Rajiv, but I'm not sure that our audience, the audience of The Glenn Show, knows about the great news, that great news being my elevation to the status of Distinguished Fellow of the American Economics Association. Now, if I were to dwell on this, people would think me immodest. So I wonder if you would be willing to dwell for just a moment on what that's about and why that might be thought to be significant. Thank you very much, Rajiv.
Sure. So it's been a while since I've been on your show, so this is somewhat old news now. You were elected a 2016 Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association, and I believe that honor goes to at most 4 people every year, at least through the election, based on a lifetime of work. And in the citation, they mentioned a very, very broad range of contributions, including, of course, the work that's well known on group inequality. So, segregation and its impacts on inequality between groups, as well as stereotypes and the effects of affirmative action, and also work that may not be as well known to a general audience, which is your work on natural resource economics, on development economics, the rotating savings and loan associations, and so on. And so it's a tremendous honor. You share this with some of the leading lights of the profession. I will say that the citation omitted to mention my favorite paper of yours, which is Self-Censorship in Public Discourse, which we spent an hour talking about on this show a while back, and which may be connected to some of the themes we'll discuss today. So there's more even than the citation mentions. So congratulations on that honor.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, and thanks for the wonderful promotional remarks about my career. I appreciate it very much. I do want people to know that I try to be a serious economist as well as a gadfly pundit, and there's actually some evidence to support that view. Anyway, enough. We're talking about talking, and we are here in the age of allegations of fake news and, a president who is regularly accused of not hewing to the truth. We're in an age of polarization and, people circling the wagons around their preferred political point of view, perhaps talking in, bubbles more or less to themselves and others who have a like-minded opinion and things of this sort. And these are matters that you and I in our academic writings have attended to, and they are matters that have attracted the attention of some of the, I think, most interesting social thinkers over the last century or so. So you were mentioning Albert Hirschman, for example, in our preliminary discussion for this conversation. So I'm especially interested to hear from you about this because you've been writing these papers about public communication, disagreement, and so on. And as you noted, I have worked on this problem of self-censorship. So what are your preliminary thoughts here in this early 2017 environment? What are your concerns? What do you think is going on? What do you think is going to happen?
So it's really astonishing to me, actually, the extent to which we have public disagreement about very basic statements of fact. It's been that way for a long time, but it seems to have escalated recently. So regarding statements made by the current president, about such trivial matters as crowd size at the inauguration, the tapping of phones, the who actually won the popular vote, the number of people voting, feloniously in the last U.S. election, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a whole bunch of such claims that, there are statements about actual facts, which may or may not be easy to verify. But you have people who are adhering to these facts, and there are people who think that they're obviously wrong, and they don't find each other's views informative. So just by way of background, as you know, I work in microeconomic theory, and in part of my work is in the economics of information, and this is something that is puzzling from the standard models of economics, right? Because our standard models of economics view beliefs as arising from information, and not to get too bogged down in details, but if people's beliefs are supposed to differ only because they have differences in information, then they ought to find belief differences informative. If you and I disagree because we have different information, then the knowledge of that disagreement should be informative. When I realize that you and I have different beliefs about, let's say, climate change or the economic impact of the minimum wage, I ought to then, both of us ought to then revise our beliefs in light of the fact that we have just learned that we each have different information. But that kind of revision process does not take place or has not taken place about the set of issues that I mentioned, as well as many going back decades now. And so my work, actually most of it with Mohammed Yildiz on this topic, really looks at the process of belief revision that can accommodate this kind of public disagreement and what some of the consequences of that are. And just to wrap up, one of the consequences is that if people don't consider belief differences informative, so the fact that we disagree is not itself informative to me, then that means that information that you receive that I don't directly receive doesn't make its way to me. I don't revise my beliefs based on your beliefs. And in that situation, segregation really matters. It really matters whether I get my information firsthand or whether I get it through you. And so, segregation of information flows then can affect the degree of disagreement in society, which is actually something that is incompatible with the standard common knowledge of rationality model of economics. So sorry if that's a bit too technical, but
no, I think it's a little technical, but I don't think it's beyond the ken of the people who might be listening to us. Different individuals see independent information and then communicate. I don't see what you see. You don't see what I see. If indeed the only reason we have different views about some controversial matter is because we have seen different things, the fact of our different views ought to inform us, each of us, that there's more to what's going on than what we individually have seen. That's clear enough. And when that doesn't happen, then there are interesting implications, one of which is that the structure of the networks through which people communicate with one another becomes relevant to the extent to which new information can usefully enter into the public conversation. And I think those things are all worth noting, but I want to ask you a question. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with the extent to which, let's just stay within the framework of you and I talking about some controversial issue. Trump is going to put out a tax plan, I'm told, momentarily. And we can decide whether we like it or not, or whether it's going to be good or bad for this or that aspect of economic performance. You and I are both economists. We have information relevant to that question, and it might not be the same information. However, if I take your public expression not only to be a candid and straightforward report of what you've seen, but rather to be a strategic move in some kind of game in which you have a preference for the outcome of the interaction that differs from my own, then I might discount what you say to me because I suspect that you're trying to manipulate me by falsely reporting what it is that you may have seen. I doubt the sincerity of your expression because I suspect your motive for expressing in a particular way. And that would seem to throw a monkey wrench into this nice, neat, formula of we're going to amalgamate our respective information by taking each other seriously.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So, imagine that a company or an individual would benefit or would be hurt if there was a carbon tax imposed. It might be in their interests to take a public position that climate change is not occurring or is not a serious problem, even if they believe something quite different from that. And that incentive for insincerity can block the transmission of information through conversation. That's right. That's right. But I believe that what's going on is not so much. Of course, the effects that you just identified, people strategically make statements to try to persuade, and may not be completely sincere in the views that they express, is part of what's going on. But part of it is also that people question the rationality of others. People believe that others are simply mistaken, even when they are quite convinced that the beliefs expressed are sincere. And that's part of what's going on too, that there's at least the sense I get is that on issues related to, let's say the effect of a tax, whether climate change is occurring, would a minimum wage have significant employment costs and so on these kind of issues, people consider each other to be just simply wrong rather than just insincere. And that also is a factor that blocks
So let me draw your attention to a very concrete illustration of the phenomenon that you're talking about. The phenomenon right now you're talking about is I discount what someone is saying because I don't think they're competent to assess whatever it is they may have seen. Not necessarily that they're trying to manipulate me, but simply that they are, they're wrong. And I want to call our attention to this notion of climate change denier. I was just reading in the newspaper the other day, it was the New York Times, and they were talking about Scott Pruitt. This was in an editorial. This is the man formerly of Oklahoma, who is now the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And he was referred to in an editorial in the newspaper as a climate change denier. And I was struck by that use of language. And I wonder if you agree, or if you disagree, you could disabuse me of my mistake in this case. It seemed to me entirely inappropriate that, the epithet climate change denier, I think, is meant to describe someone who is anti-science or ignorant of science, or doesn't respect the authority of science, such that facts, namely that the climate is changing, that man-made activity is implicated in that, and that there's an urgent need to do something about that, facts are being denied by this person. There's an alternative interpretation, I think, much more, favorable to the intelligence and the integrity of Mr. Pruitt, which is that such sciences may exist, he is aware of, but the implications of that science for how policy should be conducted at the Environmental Protection Agency are controversial. Not everyone comes to the same conclusion about it. And the fact that he doesn't share your view about whatever it might be that we must do in the face of the impending threat of climate change doesn't mean that this man is a know-nothing. It just means that he has taken a different implication out of whatever the common set of scientific facts might be. That's a much more favorable interpretation of the fact that he denies the urgent need to, cap CO2 emissions at electric power generating plants or whatever. It means that in his calculation of the benefits and costs associated with various ways of responding to the commonly known scientific data, he comes out rather differently than you do. Or in the strategic interaction between nation states on the planet who have somehow to reach a cooperative understanding about how to go forward in dealing with this problem, China rising, India industrializing, and so on. He has a different calculation about the role that the United States should play in that strategic transnational interaction, and thinks that moving first, rather than it being a model of what other nations will follow, is a poor opening play in the strategic game of trying to see who's going to bear the cost at the global level of dealing with what is in fact a global problem. I can come up with a lot of stories about why somebody wouldn't sign off on the New York Times editorial board's climate policy, and only one of them would be that the person doesn't believe in science. And for someone who had been Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma, I'd be disinclined to impute to them ignorance or kind of denial of the authority of scientific knowledge, given that there are these other entirely plausible accounts of why they don't come out on the same page as Bill McGibbon or somebody.
Okay, well, let me challenge that a little bit.
Good.
Let's compare it, let's say, to somebody who believes that 9/11 was an inside job, quite sincerely, or that believes that President Obama, former President Obama, was not born in the United States.
You really think those are comparable?
I'm asking you to. I'm asking you to dwell on the differences.
Okay.
Yeah. So you personally might consider those 9/11 truthers or the so-called birthers to be beyond the pale, right? That they are simply wrong, that they are not processing evidence properly, or are being insincere in the expression of their beliefs for manipulative reasons, which may well be the reason why our current president was spent quite a bit of time, challenging the fact that Barack Obama was born in the United States. Now, people who dismiss the birthers and the truthers and so on and so forth do so because they believe that there's an overwhelming the set of evidence in favor of a position which can't be verified with 100% certainty, but the evidence is overwhelming. They believe that 9/11 was actually a hostile act committed by Al-Qaeda, or that Barack Obama was in fact born in Hawaii. And so they therefore describe the opposing view in disparaging terms. Now, with regard to climate change, I think the people who make that charge likewise feel that the evidence that the planet is warming and that this is due to human action is itself overwhelming, that there's a very, very substantial group of scientists who have looked at the evidence and have come to this conclusion that that the dissenters are as small a minority in this case. Probably the dissenters are smaller in terms of pure numbers in the case of climate change within the scientific community than the dissenters in the case of the birth certificate and 9/11. So they are coming at it from that position. Now, you personally may consider that to be unreasonable because you can think of stories.
I just clarify? I want to clarify something.
Yeah.
The point I was trying to make is that there are two different things here. One is what's happening to the climate, and the other is what to do about it. And the imputation of the status of being a denier because one does not agree with the policy prescription that is, as being advocated, says about the person who disagrees with the policy that they don't understand the science, and I'm saying that needn't follow, and that's why
I think I would distinguish between the policy response to climate change and the belief in climate change itself. So I think the term denier ought to be reserved for somebody who actually does deny the phenomenon of climate change and what are believed to be its primary causes. Now, I would not use the term denier, and I don't think it's appropriate to use the term denier for somebody who thinks that one policy is preferred to another, whatever that might be. So that's
but it is
that's the semantic.
Yeah.
Huh? It ought not to be. When you talk about for clarity, just for clarity of communication, the term denier should be reserved for people who deny something rather than believe that it may have net benefits, or believe that a certain a wait and see policy or a laissez-faire policy is preferred. I think the term denier, at least the way in which I usually see it used, is about claims about scientific fact rather than about policy. But clearly, I can see that you are referencing an article in which maybe it was used differently, so I misunderstood.
And I'm calling attention, I think, to what seems to be a pretty widespread practice in the progressive community with respect to this particular issue of climate change, of basically impugning the intelligence and the integrity of people who take a different position. I mean, there's this point, this is an urgent matter. Earth is in the balance. There's no more important question. We're dealing with the future of the planet. Okay? Full stop. Let's pull out all stops. Let's get busy saving the planet. Now, this is a question that involves a lot of value judgments, including how it is that we weight the well-being of future generations to the present generation, including estimates about the extent to which in the future technological progress will continue to produce solutions to problems that we don't see how they're going to be solved right now. Should I impose trillions of dollars of cost over some period on the present generation in the face of this problem? Depends on, as I've said, I don't want to repeat myself, how I weigh present and future generations' welfare and what I think the trajectory of forward-going human activity is going to be, not just in terms of producing hydrocarbons in the environment, but also in terms of producing, cleaner ways of manufacturing and generating transportation and such and so forth. These are judgments. And some of them are value judgments, and some of them are forecasts that will have a large variance in the error of estimate. And the idea that people might come out in different positions on that hardly strikes me as indicative of their denial. And I'll stop. But isn't this posture denier, ignoramus? I mean, it bleeds over into if someone is a religious person and they have views about policy based upon their religious conviction, then they're thought to be a know-nothing. Isn't this somehow connected to the deplorables, to the idea that individuals who are not with the New York Times editorial page are stupid, are backward, are, in some other way undesirable? Anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah, I just think it's very hard actually to isolate positions on a particular issue, whether it is climate change or the impact of tax cut or impact of minimum wages, from other statements. So this is something very unique, I think, to the current environment in the United States. So statements about the crowd size at the inauguration, or the birthplace of the former president, or whether or not 3 to 5 million people cast illegal votes and the popular vote victor, as declared by the media, was in fact not in fact the winner of the popular vote, and so on. And so the obvious dismissal of these claims then spills over, I think, to areas where perhaps more considered judgment ought to be made. But it contaminates discourse.
Let me say for the record that the president, this is Donald J. Trump, has played fast and loose with, quote, the facts, close quote, throughout his political career since first announcing for this office. He said many things that have been not either for which there is no evidence to demonstrate or that they are demonstrably false. Mm-hmm. And he ought not to do that, and he especially ought not to do that as president. And I just want to go on the record saying that so that no one is confused, thinking because I am taking in some ways a contrarian view to the progressive posture on these things, that I'm not aware of the fact that the president is doing these things.
I wasn't suggesting
go ahead.
I wasn't suggesting you were endorsing those views at all. I was just pointing out that there's a contamination effect. When one makes statements such as those, it makes conversation about genuinely important and uncertain questions more difficult.
Duly noted.
Okay.
Duly noted. Let me give another example. Okay, so this is an example of, I'm trying to give examples in which there's public disagreement about facts, even though the facts are, in principle, ascertainable. And that has to do with the police, Black Lives Matter, the killing of unarmed persons, the extent to which the violent crime upsurge that we've seen in the last couple of years is due to a so-called Ferguson effect. The question of how it is that you maintain order in an unruly environment like a huge American metropolis, and what do you do about weapons on the street, and whether or not certain policing techniques are effective at reducing crime, and so on and so on. It seems to me that, take a person like Heather McDonald at the Manhattan Institute and oppose her to any of a number of people. Let me name Khalil Muhammad as one. He's a professor at the Kennedy School of Government. He works on criminal justice and African American. His book is called The Condemnation of Blackness, and I think you would have to call him a relatively radically progressive commentator on these issues. So these people are at opposite ends of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. Heather McDonald at the Manhattan Institute, a conservative, not permitted to speak on university campuses, practically causing a riot at UCLA and at Claremont McKenna, where she tried to give lectures and students objected vociferously to her presence. Khalil Muhammad, who's a progressive, I don't know of him having been shouted down by conservative crowds anywhere, but I imagine he would draw the ire of some of those audiences if he were to appear with his arguments about the racial oppressiveness of mass incarceration and so on and so on.
Yeah.
Now this is an area where, there are facts and then there are facts. So, if I have a video of a cop shooting some guy in the back running away from a car because of a traffic violation, that's certainly a fact. Mm-hmm. Can't deny the fact that happened. That's right there. We can see it. On the other hand, if I have statistics as aggregated by in the uniform crime reports or victim surveys or whatever about the racial disparity in the committing of violent acts, with blacks being vastly disproportionately overrepresented amongst violent criminals in the country, and I want to dwell on that. I want to call attention to that. I want to identify the race of someone who commits a crime on Brown University's campus. And I just will stop, but we've now discontinued the practice when reporting criminal offenses against our members of our community of identifying the assailant by race, even when that information is known. It's not put into the public reports because we don't want to foster stereotypes. What is your reaction to my general concern that I'm trying to express here, that our discussions about these matters in the United States, about crime, about punishment, about race, about policing, about the maintenance of order. The commissioner of the police in New York City being unable to give a lecture here at Brown University a few years ago because an audience of angry students and townspeople thought that he represented evil racism because he believed in public order policing, in broken windows policing, in stop and frisk policing in his city. Your city.
Yeah.
Can we talk effectively in the United States about how to maintain order in cities, about the extent to which crime and violence are correlated with racial identity, and that's a relevant fact in trying to understand racial disparities in the incidents of police violence and so forth? I mean, I realize that I skirt on, the boundaries of very sensitive matters here, but it seems to me this is another area in which public disagreement is significant.
Absolutely,
in which deliberation is not as effective as it might be.
Yes. Well, we spent an hour on a previous episode of your show talking about precisely these issues. They are crucially important. They are very sensitive, as you put it. They are matters of life and death. And for that reason, it's important to have a robust conversation that is really fact-based, on these things. And you're right that there are people with hardened opinions on these issues, and on all sides, frankly, about an issue about which there still remains considerable uncertainty, I would say. As you know, I'm writing a book about these issues with Dan O'Flaherty, and about some things, there's the evidence speaks pretty conclusively, which is, for example, the use of non-lethal force by police against African American communities. That's whereas with regard to lethal force, I think that the evidence is more ambiguous, as you and I have seen, and that we discussed in our previous conversation. Regarding the speech on campus, yes, I mean, that I have found it very troubling that people are prevented from speaking and are shouted down. I disagree with Heather McDonald on her interpretation of what's going on. I think that there is a kind of a Ferguson effect in the sense that there are communities from which the police have pulled back, partly as a result of protests such as those we have seen in Ferguson, but the motives for them doing so, to my mind, are questionable. I really think that there's an interpretation that she puts on this pullback that is much more favorable to an understanding of police behavior than I would. But I think it's a debate that ought to be had. And you've had Heather McDonald on your show, and she ought to be speaking at campuses and robustly questioned and challenged by those who may disagree with her.
And I will
and the
have
same goes. The same goes with many other incidences. You could have mentioned several others. So I think that people have. This is an instance of public disagreement. You're right, where people have hardened opinions without necessarily looking deep enough at the facts, and in some cases the jury is definitely still out.
What? I mean, Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Okay, 2 independent investigations of what happened between him and Darren Wilson. The police officer came to the conclusion that the officer acted within his appropriate authority when he shot Michael Brown. And yet, in progressive quarters around the country, Michael Brown will still be put forward as a exemplar of a general phenomenon of unaccountable police violence against innocent African Americans. Trayvon Martin in Florida. Now, a jury finds that George Zimmerman acted legitimately in self-defense in that situation. Again, the narrative that continues to animate a protest around the country and which draws on that circumstance doesn't credit what the jury finds in that case. I mean, I'm very seldom made aware when I'm reading people's commentaries about that in progressive press about the fact that indeed George Zimmerman, who was not white but Latino, acted according to a jury's finding in defense of his life appropriately or at least legally in that circumstance. Now, aren't these instances of denial of the facts, not in a minor matter of how big is a crowd at some inauguration, but rather in a major matter of what is the dynamic of sort of legitimate concern about racial oppression? What is the character and the shape of racial oppression in our country? Should these things be allowed to go unchallenged? That the things that I'm talking about are the persistent reiteration of a false narrative about events that are shaping in an important way the public's attitude on vital matters.
Well, Glenn, the fact that you describe this narrative as false with such certainty is itself a little bit troubling to me. I'll tell you why. Because if you look at the grand jury testimony in the case regarding Michael Brown and Darren Wilson, you find extraordinary disagreement within the set of witnesses about 2 very, very important statements of fact. Did he have his hands up, and was he charging towards the officer? And in sworn testimony before the grand jury, you had people swearing that he had his hands up, and you had others swearing that he did not. And then you had, the same kind of bifurcation occurred with regard to the second question as to whether he was charging the officer. Now, taking all that evidence into account, the grand jury decided not to prosecute. But to interpret that as some sort of definitive statement that ought to lead people to alter their beliefs one way or another, I think is overinterpreting the final judgment. I think the final judgment comes out, through the aggregation of a series of pieces of evidence, which might point to something really quite ambiguous. And a grand jury either has to make a decision to prosecute or not. It's a binary decision. Same with the case of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. To interpret that final decision as being somehow definitive is I think not warranted in these situations. And the one other thing I would say about the Trayvon Martin case is that even if one agrees with the jury, I'm not saying I do, but if one agrees with the jury that in the particular situation in which force was used, that it was warranted, one could still be very deeply troubled by the fact that the entire interaction itself would not have arisen were it not for a suspicion that turned out to be completely unwarranted. So
no, I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
It should never have happened, and George Zimmerman was in the wrong for precipitating that situation. I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, I just think that when you're forced to make a binary choice,
I just want to say, a jury, I don't know what other basis I'm going to have for having an opinion other than the deliberation that is informed in a systematic way by a trial, such as what the jurors would have witnessed. And in the case of Ferguson, Missouri, I have two independent investigations reaching the same conclusion. And while there was conflicting testimony about what happened, the reports were weighted by the credibility of the reports. That's a part of the discussion as well. The reason they didn't accept and follow the implications of the testimony of some witnesses is because they found those witnesses less credible than other witnesses. So it doesn't seem to me that I have any other basis for a definitive judgment than the findings of these duly constituted bodies, both a local and a federal body who looked into that situation.
I just, my point is simply this, Glenn, that whenever a body is forced to make a binary judgment, either we take this action or we take a different action, a complementary action, they can do so with varying degrees of certitude, right? You could be, 90% sure that there ought to be no prosecution, or you could be 51% sure. If you're making your decision, never quite being certain as to whether it's the right decision, recognition of the fact that it's a judgment call that may be made with greater or lesser confidence ought to temper one's interpretation of the binary decision. I just think that one ought to be careful not to treat one jury's decision just like another's if they happen to point in the same direction.
So I have a question. Would you be, had these juries found differently?
Yeah.
Would you be open to the same objection coming in the other direction?
Yes, I think so, because if think back to the O.J. Simpson trial, right? I think with regard to the O.J. Simpson trial, the jury made a decision, and there were many people who felt that they had come to the wrong decision. They aggregated the evidence. I'm talking about the criminal trial now.
No, I don't talk about that. I'm laughing because I don't know if you've seen Dave Chappelle's most recent, Netflix produced.
I haven't.
Well, it's a routine largely built around several meetings that he had with O.J. Simpson and also his admiration of Bill Cosby. It's just very funny and people should see it. But about O.J., he says on one occasion when he and some other African-American men had an encounter with O.J., and O.J. was very cordial and gracious, and they went back and forth and back and forth. As soon as O.J. left the room, they turned to each other and they said, "That nigga did it." Quote unquote. He did it. Kind of like that. So, and the Bill Cosby thing, I just say this because it's so funny. He starts out his routine by reference to some imaginary character that he proposed for a potential movie to a producer who was a superhero but also a rapist. The only way that he could get his powers going was that he had to touch a part of a woman's body, and that would activate his powers. And so whenever an emergency came where the superhero needed to, call upon his powers in order to save humanity, he'd have to touch a woman inappropriately without her permission in order to be so empowered, which makes him a rapist. But he's also a superhero who's doing good for mankind. And Chappelle relates that Bill Cosby, and he then goes on to talk about the pioneering work of Cosby's career on television and what it all meant to him, and as a comic coming along, and Cosby's philanthropy and whatnot. Cosby the superhero, but he's a rapist. What can I say? I mean, whatever. Anyway, that's neither here nor there relative to our conversation, but it's a plug for Dave Chappelle, who's back and who's a very funny man.
Yeah, I'll take a look. He's quite insightful also sometimes. I find him to be a very interesting comedian. I will take a look at that.
Yeah. Well, that's not entirely unrelated to our subject because comedians whether they be the late night set who are lampooning Donald Trump on a daily basis, or they be some rude person who's prepared to break a politically correct taboo and talk about sensitive issues of gender or gender identity or race or whatever in a rude way that upsets audience. They play a role, don't they, in enlivening and broadening the range of acceptable public discourse and getting certain questions on the table via comedy that might be much more difficult to raise at all if you try to do it in a straight way.
That's absolutely true. I mean, this was true in the former Soviet Union, where certain well-known comedians were able to get away with criticism of the Politburo, whereas others could have been jailed for it. It was true, very much true, of Richard Pryor, who said things, who made what might at that time have been subversive statements, but did it under the veil of comedy in ways that that were also deliberately sort of. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to mention Dick Gregory in this.
Dick Gregory, yes.
Forgotten.
That's right. So absolutely, that's true. That's absolutely true. But when you said that comedy is not entirely disconnected from our discussion today, I thought you were going to reference something quite different, which was the piece you sent me about late night comedians mocking or disparaging Trump, and that the backlash to this was actually part of the story of Trump's election. Do you recall that?
No, I do recall it. I do. Well, why don't we talk about it? I've been talking a lot. Why don't you explain to people what we're talking about here?
Well, you had sent me a few weeks ago, when we were thinking about what kinds of themes we might explore in this conversation, an article that made the claim that some late night comedy shows that were sort of openly mocking and disparaging of Trump may have actually amplified support for him as a backlash. Does that reasonably accurately describe that piece?
Oh yeah, it's, if you want, you could call it the smugness factor.
Yeah. So
okay, and it doesn't persuade anybody, but maybe it hardens the people who are on the other side from the comic, because they feel that the comic is not only criticizing the object of their affection, in this case Donald Trump, but also sneering at them. Because who could support such a person, such an idiot, such a asshole, such a cipher, such an ignoramus, such a crude man? Who would support him but a fool or a knave? And when people hear a late night comedian speaking of themselves, in effect, in that way, one self-protective reaction is to double down on their support and to dismiss the comedian.
I think that's right. I think that's. I think this was actually an important factor in the last election, and what we've seen over the past 12 months or so during the primaries as well. That open mockery or smugness of Trump, got people to support him with greater enthusiasm and greater commitment. And I'll give you one example that I thought about a while ago. It was almost a year ago today. So it was the so-called taco tweet, on Cinco de Mayo last year. Yeah. You might recall that Donald Trump on Twitter. This is probably not the most outrageous thing he's done on Twitter, but it attracted a great deal of attention. It was, wishing the Latino community a happy Cinco de Mayo and mentioning that the best tacos are in Trump Tower, and there was a picture of him eating one of these taco bowls. I think that's roughly what was the content of that tweet, and it was ridiculed and mocked mercilessly on social media, and to some extent, understandably, right? I mean, it was inappropriate. It was, it was self-centered. It was, there's a lot of things that were, just almost an invitation for mockery. But that got me thinking, wondering whether that was actually some something strategic, actually, that Trump over and over again deliberately invited the mockery of for want of a better term, one can call the establishment. So that invited the contempt, actually, knowingly, because he was aware that it would enhance his support among others who had felt the sting of that same contempt. And so I instead of it being, instead of seeing it as a faux pas, like an error of judgment, a sort of inadvertent admission of a certain level of crassness or lack of empathy, I thought perhaps this is actually strategic, and I still don't know whether it was or not. But the effect of it, I think, not only this particular tweet, but also over and over again other statements that he may have made that others have considered outrageous, and openly mocked and ridiculed and treated with contempt, even among those who may not actually defend those actions or those statements, it may have reminded them of contempt that they themselves may have experienced at the hands of others, and caused them to coalesce really behind his candidacy. I don't think this is a small factor. I'll give you two other examples. So one is a series of articles in The Guardian by Chris Arnade. I don't know if you have read any of these.
I've not.
He's very active on Twitter. It's well worth following. And he's I think a physicist originally, then a Wall Street quant, I believe a bond trader. He made a fortune over there, but then he just spent the last year or so just driving across the United States, 100,000 miles, I think he put on his car, just talking to all kinds of people, mostly Trump supporters, and wrote pieces about this. It's got threads on Twitter that are quite insightful, but also articles in The Guardian. And this effect, you must take a look. I mean,
what's his name again, Reggie?
Chris Arnade. I hope I'm saying it right. So the last name is Arnate. And if you look at his archives on the Guardian website, you'll find one in particular which references the 100,000 miles he put on his car. And this was published on November 3rd. This was just prior to the election. But he had a series of articles before the election and after. And this effect comes up over and over again. Just people who just feel that sting of contempt and are uninterested in details about the fine points of policy, and just feel that they've found their candidate, because in part because he's triggering the same sort of contempt. We both, I want to stop and give you a chance to talk, but we are both admirers of the work of Albert Hirschman, and in particular his book Exit, Voice and Loyalty. I know you've written about.
That's what I was going to mention next anyway. So
maybe I should just hand over to you. But I think that this idea that he introduced into economics of the importance of voice, the tendency of human beings to need to make expressive action, is also relevant to this discussion. But I should stop talking and hand off to you. Maybe. Do you see the relevance of Hirschman's concept of voice to this discussion?
I do. This is Albert Hirschman's book, Exit, Voice and Loyalty, the late 1960s or early 1970s. Hirschman, now dead, a great economist of the second half of the 20th century, many years at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where both you and I were his colleagues when we were fellows at the Institute for a wonderful year of our careers that we had the opportunity to hang out there. In any case, so the argument in the book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, calls attention to contrast two different mechanisms by which an organization might be induced to reform itself if it gets off track. One through voice, which is the process of internal criticism by members of the organization who see that things are wrong and who confer with one another and try to persuade one another to alter the course. And the other through exit, which is the economic process or competitive process where if an organization gets off track, its followers or members or customers might simply take their vote with their feet and go elsewhere. Do I leave or do I stay and fight for the right policy of my party, my company, my neighborhood, my social group, whatever? Exit or voice. And Hirschman did its exit, voice, and loyalty because the idea of staying and fighting instead of going off to someplace else is in a way an expression of loyalty, and in fact a more profound expression of loyalty, a willingness to incur the wrath of one's fellow organization members by deviating and criticizing. A more profound expression of loyalty then would be the blind loyalty of simply going along with the majoritarian view of the people who happen to be in the organization at a point in time, not criticizing one's own. So these are wonderful ideas that are developed with elegance and precision and wit and wisdom in this very fine piece of social science from Albert Hirschman, roughly 1970. And still relevant to many of the things that we're talking about today, whether it be, how does one as an African American who is concerned about crime in his neighborhood, but who is also aware of the fact that the police do use excessive force against blacks and that there are hostile forces in the polity, conservatives who want to lock them up and throw away the key and who see every young black youngster on the street as a potential thug. And if I'm loyal to my people, I don't want to seem to be trafficking with these bigots. On the other hand, I might think that the relatively lax response of contemporary African American leadership to the victimization of our own Black Lives Matter movement that seems somehow never to be able to get around to talking about blacks who take black lives and why that should be a part of their agenda. I may want to voice criticisms of that in a constructive way, but may feel that the bonds of fealty that I have to my co-racialists prohibit me from doing so. That would only be one. I mean, maybe much more significant would be I'm an American. My country has conflicts around the world. I want to be patriotic, and on the other hand, I also want not to suspend my critical faculties by simply lining up behind a 2003 invasion of Iraq or whatever it might be as, a loyal American. I want to be a critic, even though being a critic may have may run the risk that people will call me a traitor. Still, loyalty to my country means fighting for what I think is right for my country more so than it means simply going along with whatever the majoritarian view happens to be at a point in time, something like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's a nice summary of the major themes of that book. But the reason I thought of it was because Hirschman is very critical of this what has come to be called the hoteling downs model of political competition, where basically in a two-party system, the parties will be essentially indistinguishable. They'll both converge to the preferences of the median voter because all they care about is vote share maximization and so on. And the reason he was critical is because he felt that, the people who are on the extreme fringes of a political party, they have nowhere to exit. But that will induce them to exercise voice all the more vigorously. And so, you will get genuine distinctions in the platforms of different parties because the people who have nowhere to go are not powerless, as in the hoteling down models, but, are especially incentivized to exercise voice and to pull the party away from positions that are obnoxious to them. And what I was thinking about is actually, what happens if voice is repressed? So you have, I mentioned earlier this piece that you wrote on self-censorship, which I think is very, very deep and very interesting. But part of the process of self-censorship is the suppression of one's own voice. That's in essence the definition of self-censorship. And what happens then if one's voice is suppressed for those reasons? You believe that you'll be sanctioned or punished if you speak up and express your views sincerely. What do you then do? Then I think that the Hirschman's great insight was that you're not just going to remain silent. You'll find alternative ways of expression. And what we see there is in anonymous posts in chat rooms, on Twitter accounts, on Yik Yak. So college students, you mentioned what's going on college campuses. So Yik Yak is an app that allows the college students to identify themselves as part of a community, but not as individuals, and they can post anonymously and with great freedom. Although that may be changing, the specific rules for posting on that app are in flux. But the idea is that people will find ways to express themselves, but will not do it. But will do it anonymously. Will do it in disguise. And one way you do this, of course, is because we have a secret ballot, in elections, and so. The suppression of voice in one arena can give rise to its manifestation in others, and I think that also may be part of the story of the last election, that people went to the ballot box and exercised voice in ways that they felt they could not in their own communities. There's a very insightful article by Connor Friedersdorf, I don't know if you read it, from May of last year, where he has an email exchange with a 22-year-old Trump supporter in San Francisco.
I did see it.
And again, this theme comes up where essentially the incentives are to dissemble or to remain silent. And I suspect this goes on all over America in areas that are either overwhelmingly liberal or overwhelmingly conservative, overwhelmingly, Christian or overwhelmingly socially liberal or socially conservative, etc., etc. So that the minority, the dissenters, are in some sense prevented from freely exercising voice in the normal manner or the healthiest manner, and then end up doing it in other ways. And I think I'm not really getting to a particular point here, but I just think this is a phenomenon that we are observing.
I think you're making an interesting observation. We're probably going to need to conclude soon, but let me just put one thing to you that troubles me a little bit about anonymity. Looking at the comments section in various online publications, and you see people being very rude and with each other, which is something we do see on social media, calling each other idiots and fools and worse. And, on the one hand, the secret ballot is a great institution because it precludes, when I exercise my franchise, that people knowing how I voted could then be used against me later, and I could therefore be intimidated or coerced somehow into voting one way out of a fear of what others will say should they know how I voted. Okay, so anonymity is a good thing in that respect. On the other hand, in a chat room somewhere, anonymity frees me from the constraint that I might otherwise feel associated with damage to my reputation from being known to be the kind of person who uses profanity or who is rude or contemptuous or worse toward others with whom he might disagree. Now that I'm anonymous under the cloak of some, moniker that doesn't allow people to identify me personally, I can give free vent, and give free rein without consequence. Mm-hmm. And it just strikes me that the values of anonymity I'm on a university faculty and we have to vote appointments. And we don't do secret ballot. We go around the table and everybody says what they think about the prospective appointment in the face of others. Now, you don't have to say much. You can say, I abstain. You can say, I support it. And no one can make you give reasons why. But that performance that we engage in, that collective enterprise of producing a consensus about a candidate through open discussion, is interesting to me, and I'm not sure it's right or wrong, but it is a kind of attempt to balance the competing objectives of the security of private voice, so that I'm not influenced by social pressures on the one hand, and the integrity of a public voice, for which I have to be accountable over a period of time. I can't simply oppose all international trade specialists because I think international trade is meaningless. I have to give reasons why I oppose that, and so on. So I don't know if you have any thought about that, but I just thought.
Yeah, I think the meaning of what one says is quite different, depending on whether it's said anonymously or whether it's said, with one's name signed onto it. And there are, of course, the secret ballot has other reasons for it. To prevent people bribing other people to vote a particular way, for instance. But there are advantages and disadvantages. I think it has to be adjudicated on a case-specific basis. Whether anonymity is harmful on net or beneficial on net.
Indeed. And on that note, perhaps we can call it a conversation. Rajiv, thanks for your time. Rajiv Sethi, Barnard College, Columbia University. So we'll do it again.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.